So there's a couple of different things that our DNA can tell us about exercise or performance. Firstly, injury being extremely important, whether you have a genetic basis for a risk of injury. Of course, there's many other factors that also play a role in injury that you need to take into account, but it can give a baseline measurement of risk for injury. We can also look at whether you have high inflammatory markers or high risk for oxidative stress with exercise, and those two impacting how you recover from exercise and how frequently you should be exercising. And then the exciting part of the genetics of sports is around performance and what type of training you're most likely to respond well to, whether that be more of an endurance style, long duration training, or more strength training, short interval training, high intensity training on the power side of things. So based on those different aspects that you can tell from your genetics, the recovery that I mentioned, the injury, and then the performance side of things. So what we've done with the DNA Sport report is laid it out into those three areas: risk for injury, recovery and how fast you recover, and then performance being power versus endurance. Some other aspects that we also have included in the DNA Sport test, is caffeine metabolism, as that's often used as a stimulant. So that's also in a separate section in DNA Sport. So what we will do based on your genetics, so we look at different genetic variants that are linked to injury risk, such as variation in the genes that encode for collagen fibers. And from those different variations, we can classify an individual as either having a low injury risk, a medium injury risk, or a high injury risk based on their genetics. And always bearing in mind is that genetics is one piece of the puzzle, and then the practitioner should take into account everything else as well. So in terms of recovery, we look at genetic variations that are linked to inflammatory markers. We look at genetic variations that are linked to oxidative stress, all of which are normal aspects that happen with exercise. Inflammation will happen with exercise. It's just a case of how much inflammation you have in comparison to the next person. And if we know whether you are recovering slowly, moderately, or at an average rate, or quickly, we can time your training sessions, intensity of training sessions. It might be something that a coach can use as to whether a player can play a match twice a week or only once a week. So that information on how fast you recover can be used as part of a training strategy. Okay, so again, we look at different genetic variations that have been linked to power, such as lean body mass or amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. And from that, we can tell whether your potential for power and how much adaptation you're going to have from power and strength training. Is that low, moderate, or high? And based on that, how much power training or strength training should you be including in your exercise program? Similarly, for endurance, we look at genetic variations that are linked to VO2 max, which is just your standard measurement of fitness, aerobic capacity. We look at genetic variations that are linked to slow twitch muscle fibers, vasodilation and oxygen transport to the muscles. And some individuals have a greater potential for endurance performance in comparison to others. So we want to know, from your endurance potential and your power potential, how much time should you be spending on these types of activities? If you've only got a certain amount of time to train each week, where should you prioritize your focus in order to get the best response and the best performance? So peak training times is an interesting, it's a newer area of research when it comes to sports performance, but certain gene variants have been linked to whether you are most likely to perform well in mornings or in the evenings. And so if you want to get the most out of your training sessions, you want to know when you're going to be performing best. So we can give an indication on whether that's more going to be in the mornings or in the evenings. Of course, depending on what type of event you're training for, if that event is going to be a race, for example, in the morning, you don't only want to do training sessions in the evening. Come race day, that's going to be difficult. So it's a newer area of research and something we've only recently included in the test, but it's an interesting one to know. Okay, so caffeine metabolism is a very interesting one because caffeine is the most commonly used stimulant, I think, in every day, but particularly in sports performance. And caffeine has been shown to improve both strength and power performance as well as endurance performance. And lots of people are using caffeine. However, each of us metabolize caffeine differently. So we can metabolize caffeine at a slower rate or at a faster rate. So if we know how you are metabolizing caffeine based on your genetics, we can try time that caffeine intake. So if you're a fast metabolizer of caffeine, you would want to take your caffeine in close before the start of an event or a race or match, whereas if you're a slow metabolizer, you'd want to take your caffeine in further from the start of the race, so a longer time before. When it comes to salt sensitivity, so that's an interesting one, is that some of the genes that we test for in DNA sport have been linked to blood pressure regulation, and whether salt has an influence on blood pressure. So if you do have high blood pressure, should you be reducing salt in the diet? And of course, many sports drinks contain electrolytes, contain sodium. So if someone is salt sensitive and has a high blood pressure, they will need to be wary of the types of sports drinks that they're taking in. Okay, so I think the most important part for me, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but the most important part of the DNA sport test is injury and recovery. In order to perform well in the first place, in order to have longevity when it comes to exercise and sports and performance, you want to remain healthy and remain uninjured and recover well. So if we know how our body is responding to exercise in terms of risk for injury and in terms of inflammation and recovery, we can manage that very well to ensure that we don't get injured, first of all, and then have longevity in any sport and still be exercising at the age of 50, 60, 70. So I think that's a very key area. And then when it comes to performance, I think there's a notion that this type of genetic testing is only for elite athletes. But for the average person that's exercising 4 or 5 times a week, it's important for them to know where they should be spending their time in order to get the best results. If we're not seeing improvements with exercise, we're more likely to fall off the wagon or stop exercising or think that something's not working for you. But it just might be that you're not doing the right exercise for your genetic potential. So if we can focus exercise in a particular area, know where you're going to see the best results, then that's great. For elite athletes, it can be very, very small changes that can be the difference between winning a race and coming second. So optimizing their training strategy is, of course, key. So it can work in different ways. In DNA diet, I'm sure you're aware, we look at the amount of exercise that is required for weight management. And then the next step is, okay, I know how much exercise I need to do, but what type of exercise should I be doing? So the DNA sport test can help with that and help motivate and from an exercise perspective to link the exercise to weight loss. In terms of DNA health, again, the number one step is to be healthy. You can never perform well unless you're healthy. So first step is health, and then second step is performance to ensure that you're getting a balance of both.